the cover of the 2024 issue of the IEF. As you can see there, it's prepared by the Heritage Foundation, which is a US-based foundation. And this year is actually the 30th anniversary edition. So they've been preparing this since, if you calculate 30 years back, since 1994. And they do this annually, ranking 12 freedoms, economic freedoms that are normally categorized under 4 categories, but I'll look at that shortly. And what it looks at is basically economic policies among the countries that are assessed. So for this year and even last year, the number of countries that have been assessed were around 184 sovereign states. In the past, sometimes there have been fewer states ranked in the 170-something category, but so far this year, the ranking was across 184 states, and it basically checks the impact of those freedoms on growth and prosperity. And so, for instance, for the 2024 index, it covers the period up until the 1 year before the 30th of June 2023. So, of course, they started preparing the index from the 1st of July 2023. So that is what we have ready. So it's basically July 1st, 2022 to the 30th of June 2023. That's what the rankings that we'll be discussing with you today. So that's now what comprises the 2024 index. Then we go next to the background as to why IEA, and particularly the Constitution Law and Economy Program, has been tracking this index. So if you've been attending our annual discussions on this, you may already be familiar with this, but we just reiterate. So for purposes of those who are attending this for the first time. So we have 4 main reasons, or we've compressed our reasons into these 4. The first, because we are the CLE program, we are interested in tracking and checking the constitutional prescriptions in terms of under the Bill of Rights, particularly economic freedoms, the provision of those rights, and basically the state's efforts towards the provision of those rights, guaranteeing those rights, and what implications it has for growth and prosperity. So that is the first one. So we know that the Constitution of Kenya guarantees economic freedoms amongst other rights. So in addition to the rights that are provided or listed under Chapter 4, we know that the way the Heritage Foundation categorizes the 12 economic freedoms, some of those prescriptions fall in other chapters, under other chapters of Kenya's constitutions, but they're all constitutional entitlements and guarantees. So we check to see to what extent the economic freedoms have implications for growth here in Kenya. Then the second reason is that the index of economic freedom obviously allows for comparison amongst states' performance. So I've just mentioned that we have 184 countries that were ranked in this year's issue, and usually indices, from our assessment, indices provide a good comparison for purposes of understanding how a country is performing compared to its peers, checking on performance across different indicators, which I'll come to shortly. So if where countries perform better than others, or for those that have performed dismally, you can check and see what policies in other regions allow for the advancing of economic freedoms. So why the countries that are ranked as, for instance, mostly free or free actually, free economies, so it can help countries that are ranked lower to check for what policies have created that environment in those jurisdictions to allow for better performance. So that's the second. Then the third reason is that from our annual check, the IEF has been a useful tool in assessing the constitutional order and basically the interaction between Kenyan citizens and state institutions. This is closely linked to the first reason that I've talked about. So it basically allows users for us to see how the actions and restrictions by the state promote or limit economic freedoms, how the constitutional order promotes or limits economic freedoms, and then subsequently how that affects the living conditions and opportunities for prosperity for persons in Kenya, and particularly Kenyan citizens. Then the last reason why we've been tracking it is because we have seen consistently that economic freedoms are, or just advancing or promoting economic freedoms is necessary. It's a necessary path to economic prosperity, to structural transformation. So results from this index have consistently shown us that countries where they that have stronger institutions, or where the institutional environment allows individuals and private enterprises to operate freely, then they tend to record greater economic development and prosperity. So the index, for instance, states very categorically and shows from the results, it shows that a nation's capacity to develop and to prosper is dependent on its economic system and the quality of its institutions, and then the extent to which we have economic freedoms guaranteed is strongly linked to prosperity and to resilience of economies. Leo will show us this broadly. He'll illustrate this using data and charts shortly, but that is basically a summary of why we've been tracking the index. Then we go next to, so in terms of this is like the beginning of the methodology part, just for the benefit of those of you who've not been here before or who've not interacted with the IEF before. So as I've already mentioned, this is the 30th edition. Then like previous issues, the categorization of those economic freedoms. So there are 12 economic freedoms that are categorized under 4 broad categories. The first category is on the rule of law. And so the indicators under the rule of law, which measures provision of or property rights, or the guarantee of property rights in different states, judicial effectiveness, and government integrity. So those are the sub-factors or the indicators under the rule of law pillar. And then we have the second pillar, which is on government size. And under this pillar, the IEF usually measures the tax burden, government spending, and fiscal health, basically the overall fiscal health. So that's the second. And then we have the third pillar, which looks at 4 freedoms, and basically that's the business freedom, labor freedom, and monetary freedom. And then lastly, the last pillar or category is on open markets. And basically under here, the index measures trade freedom, investment freedom, and financial freedom. So that's in summary. And then just going into just a little more details, exactly what I've mentioned, but now how those, in terms of how the index is measured. So more particularly on the sub-factors. So the key aspects here is basically the main category. I've already referred to this. Then the factors are what is now the 12 economic freedoms. So remember, there are 4 broad pillars, and then under 4 we have 3 each, bringing to total 12 economic freedoms. So the 4 factors here are what the index called the 12 economic freedoms. So the first one, as you can see under the rule of law, is property rights. And as I've well, maybe I'm not already mentioned, but under the property rights, the main sub-factors that are measured is physical property rights, IP rights, the strength of investor protection, risk of expropriation, and the quality of land administration. So checking how different jurisdictions ensure for this. Then the second economic freedom is on judicial, and the rule of law is on judicial effectiveness. Here, they measure or they assess judicial independence, the quality of the judicial process. This, of course, might look at things such as the efficiency in administration of justice, the favoritism in obtaining judicial decisions, whether there are any accusations of corruption, and so on. And then, so those are the factors under judicial effectiveness. Then we have under government integrity, the government integrity indicator. We have sub-factors such as irregular payments and bribes, transparency of government policy making, the presence or absence of corruption and perceptions of corruption, and government and civil service transparency. So those are the three economic freedoms that are measured under the rule of law category. And then with specific sub-indicators there. Then under the government size, the main economic freedoms are those three. So we have the tax burden. So looking at the top marginal tax rate on individual income, as well as the corporate income. The total tax burden is a percentage of GDP, and the implications of, for instance, does higher tax rates, what do they mean for economic prosperity? Is it always a good thing for countries that are categorized as mostly free? It's useful to check when you'll be interrogating the index in greater detail. It's useful to check whether what implications, how countries are ranked in terms of the tax burden under the IEF. Then we have the government spending. So under government spending, they check for expenditure. The expenditures represent the average total government spending at all levels as a percentage of GDP for the most recent 3 years. So it also has implications for government size. So that's why they check for that. And then the fiscal health of a nation. So basically average deficit as a percentage of GDP for the most recent 3 years. It's also keen to check how different states are performing under this category and what implications it has for basically growth and prosperity. Then the next, we have the third category. So the three economic freedoms here are property rights, under which we have physical property rights, IP rights, I had already mentioned, quality of land administration. Then we have, sorry, I think I'm repeating myself. Sorry, yes, we have regulatory efficiency. So under regulatory efficiency, we have three factors that are measured. So the first one is on business freedom, or the first freedom there is on business freedom. And here it looks at time, cost, share of income per capita, procedures of setting up business, and so on. Then we have labor freedoms, which is basically looks at other things, including the ratio of minimum wage to the average value added per worker, hindrance to hiring additional workers, to what extent do the laws and regulations allow or facilitate hiring processes, the flexibility or rigidity of working hours, mandatory severance pay, labor force participation rate, and so on. So these are what are together is categorized as labor freedom and is what is measured under this IEF. Then under monetary freedom, so the weighted average inflation rate for the most recent 3 years, which is basically a qualitative judgment on the extent of government manipulation of prices through direct controls or subsidies. Then the last one is on open markets. So under open markets, the three freedoms here that are measured are the trade freedom, investment freedom, and financial freedom. And then, so for the trade weighted average tariff rate, and the qualitative evaluation of non-tariff barriers. Then under the investment freedom, it's basically the IEF is basically looking at the national treatment of foreign investment, restrictions on land ownership for foreigners, sectoral investment restrictions, foreign exchange controls, capital controls, and so on. And then the last freedom here is the financial freedom. Then here it's basically the extent of government regulation of financial services, and the degree of the state intervention in banks and other financial firms through direct and indirect ownership. So here it also looks at government influence on the allocation of credit and the extent of financial and capital market development and openness to foreign competition. So in total, those are 12 freedoms, and you've seen the sub-freedoms that are measured. And then now once there's a ranking under each of those, we go to next. Once there's a ranking under each of those factors and sub-factors, the states are then categorized under those 1 to 5 areas. The scores are awarded under those 5 areas. And at the very top is the states that are ranked as free economies. These are the ones that have a high score of between 80 to 100. I think this year we have only had 4. We'll confirm that shortly. And so states with a score between 80 and 100 are classified as free. And this is the ideal. Then the states with a score between 70 to 79.9, these are mostly free, but not really free. So the interaction of those factors implies that those states are mostly free, but there's something that could be, there's room for improvement. And then we have the 60 to 69.9. These are states that are ranked as moderately free. Then 50 to 59.9. These states are categorized as mostly unfree, and this is where Kenya has been for several years. We'll see where it is when Leo shares the findings now. And then the worst score at the bottom is the repressed economies, and that is 0. They have a score of 0 to 49.9. And you're able to see from the assessment, from this assessment, why, what's the extent of provision of those rights in those economies are, and then you can interrogate further and check for and under their policies what has contributed to the very low scores across those factors. So next, so that's basically the methodology on the development of this IEF. Leo will now come in to share with us some of the evidence on why economic freedoms matter and illustrate this, and then give us the scores Kenya and for the EAC. So Leo, you're welcome.
Thank you so much, Jack. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you're both audible and visible.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. So, so we had this year a section on why on the evidence why economic freedoms matter, because we asked last year to explain the same, and so we'll choose 4 indicators. One being first, what does economic freedoms mean for standard of living? Second is question about incomes. Third is a question about poverty intensity, and fourth will be now an issue of innovation, because you need innovation is probably a good measure of progress. Now, just to go on, so here it's data comparing from the report comparing in the standard of living, which is now all income put together, but in purchasing power parity, now making that income comparable. So, for example, you'd see Kenyan income comparable with other countries. So that one is an economist's way of making allowing us to compare, and that purchasing power parity is essential to determine what uh, income what the income that buys some form of standard of living that is comparable across the world. What Kenyan income would buy in other jurisdictions. So you see, in terms of purchasing power parity, you see that on the lower side, that is the index of economic freedom, and then on the upper side is income. Is now income in form of dollars, $1,000. So you see that as the economic freedom scores get higher in the most free region, you see that they're in the ranges the purchasing power parity of that income is above the range of $60,000. Uh, and as the score gets lower and countries are in the repressive region or mostly unfree, the incomes are a little bit lower. So this shows that the standard of living and the correlation coefficient here is 0.73. The standard of living strongly correlates with economic freedoms. And then another thing is to ask now, comparing all these countries, the hundred, the and so comparing a set of countries uh, by category. So you see that the average income average GDP per capita in purchasing power parity terms for countries that are considered free is $103,000 in 2024. Countries which are considered mostly free is in the range of the average of $61,000, and 32,225 for those that are moderately free, and mostly unfree is $10,637. So these are averages. And then if you compare countries which are considered repressed, that's an average of $10,389 dollars. Why is this important? If you look at the countries that the average GDP per capita for the entire world, it's around $14,000. Even so, even the most repressed country or would not have that, would not be able to. The average for repressed countries is even lower uh, uh, than the average for repressed countries is even lower than the other than for the entire world. Now, again, taking multidimensional poverty, and you take the population, you find that the average percentage of population living in mostly unfree of people who are poor live in the most unfree and repressed countries, and only 1.9% of the whole population live in mostly free and moderately free countries, and showing that kind of that poverty intensity economic freedoms uh, as an is an important indicator in whether countries attain economic prosperity. Then, uh, just to add, so the same uh, using now data from the Global Innovation Index published by WIPO, data on global innovation published by WIPO, and now looking at respective economic freedoms, you see the trend line as it is, but you notice that countries countries with more economic freedoms are the most innovative, uh, are the most innovative, uh, uh, and that shows, and the correlation coefficient here is 0.74, and that is an important indicator to show that that individual autonomy, those economic liberties, and the extent of government involvement in the general economy is what role government plays in the general economy is an important factor. So allowing people to retain that autonomy and those economic liberties will drive that population, that innovation upwards. So there's still a strong correlation between global innovation and economic freedoms. Now, just to start to discuss now the 2024 results. So you notice that for Kenya's score in 2024 was 53.6. It's an 120th overall. 120th overall. There's an improvement of 1.1 score from last year, from the 2023 index, and even though Kenya is 53.6, its average, its score is higher than the sub-Saharan average by almost one percentage point. So just to start to discuss now the main results by specific indicator. So you see, in terms of the rule of law, all the three property rights, judicial effectiveness, and government integrity, all of them are way below the average. So in terms of property rights, and as Jackie explained, that what property rights measure is uh, the risk, those protections for physical property, also the protection for intellectual property, and this could include how from copyright law to all these other things, and additionally strength of investor protection, the risk of expropriation, and also how land uh, as one of the as land, which is one of the major forms of property that is always contested, is administered. So we all know, and for me, I don't think this score is surprising given the state of affairs in Kenya in the last 2 decades on how property is administered. So on judicial effectiveness, for a score for 7.7. Judicial effectiveness, as Jackie explained, measures now the quality of judicial decisions and judicial independence, and additionally, it measures favoritism in obtaining judicial decisions. So the quality, where Kenya suffers most is the quality part, which is case backlogs, and also the problem of corruption, which is not just a manifestation of judiciary of a problem in judiciary alone, but generally along all arms of government, along all from the executive now to legislature and also the other bodies. For government integrity, and Jackie explained that that one is on corruption, irregular payments and bribes, transparency in government in government's policy making. And if you look at government policy making, including the largest form of fiscal policy making that government undertakes, fiscal policy, uh, whether corruption, absence of whether corruption and those perceptions of corruption and the others, and that is a score of 31. I think, with the exception of fiscal health, this is the one probably which has a score of 11. This is the second lowest score ever. So, and that's a problem. For tax burden, the top marginal tax rate, 30%. Most countries in the world have an higher tax. The top tax marginal, marginal tax rate on individual income, and also the entire tax burden. The Kenya is considered mostly free with a score of 79. Government spending 82. Now that on government spending, that's the expenditure as a share of total, the expenditures as a share, and a 3-year average as a share of GDP. So government of Kenya spends more money on for a level of income closer to 30% on a nominal basis. And if you net it now on a real basis, 25% of GDP. And then in terms of fiscal health, where government is ranked, those are average deficits as a percentage of GDP. Kenya has had fiscal deficits in the range of 9% in the past, but in this year, it was 5.6% of GDP. And then that, so the fiscal health is scored in two ways. Debt as a share of GDP, which takes up 20% of the score, and also the deficit, which takes up 80% of the score in terms of the ranking. So you all understand why we would get a fiscal health score because of that, of the fiscal stress, the debt distress, and also and so that result is is something that has been delved in the public domain in the last 5 years. So in terms of regulatory efficiency and open market, Kenya is considered only mostly free in one category, which is the monetary freedom, score of 73. But for the others, business, labor, trade, and also financial and investment, Kenya is considered mostly and free. And the main reasons, there are main reasons why those scores reflect that. For example, so for business freedom measures almost 13 sub-factors, but mostly it's about the time and cost of and procedures of setting up businesses, which is something that in Kenya we've not been able to reform. But in terms, if you look at the overall regulatory regime, Kenya's regulatory regime is well institutionalized. What the problem is now the efficiency part, the efficiency part. Second, on the labor freedom, so that is the ratio of minimum wage and to the average value add per worker, and the influence in hiring, now regulatory measures in the influence in hiring additional workers, rigidity of hours, difficulty in terms of hiring, all those other things, like notice periods, mandatory severance pay, labor force participation rate. Yeah, so so that score, you'd see that, so it's considered mostly and free, and it's on the account of economic data on those aspects of what is measured. Trade freedom, investment freedom, financial freedom. The main challenges, so if, for example, if you consider trade, even though Kenya's average, the average trade tariff, weighted tariff, is lower, is in the middle compared to its 11.4%. Now, if you compare to Uganda, which is around 14%, and so it's not the average trade weight is not that significant. But in terms of now, if you look at the other factors, like so if you look at the other factors, in terms of trade, you realize that more markets, there is gatekeeping in most markets. So like agricultural markets, and there is a reason why those markets exist like the way it is. Uh, and specific industries, steel, and the others. So that trade freedom, even though it's where Kenya has scored most, and this is on the effect that of the tariff, the average weighted tariff, the other factors still remain significant areas of reform. Additionally, just to add on the financial sector, we have a more broader financial sector in the EAC region. We also, aside from that, Kenya's financial sector is open to competition. Now, the problems of the financial, in terms of financial freedom, is now those government influence in allocation of credit. So the problems of the Hustler Fund and the rest, the extent of capital and financial market development. So for example, you all know about the Capital Markets Authority. There is a more broader call for capital market reform to be able to serve the kind of the economy that Kenya has now. And and the degree of intervention on of the state in the banking and other financial firms, whether through direct and indirect ownership. So yeah, government has a major role in the financial sector, but in terms of the overall at the macro level, Kenya's financial sector is more is more broader, it's more stable and more open in comparison to the EAC market. Now, just to so this year we focused on the EAC three, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, to be able to provide insights on why some of these things are the way they are. So in terms of, so I'll go through quickly some select indicators, some select indicators, and then finish with a conclusion. So in terms of property rights, generally, if you look within the EAC region, uh, those protection of property rights is still a major challenge. Is still a major challenge, and in terms of property rights, it's not just physical. It's not just land alone, but also including how intellectual property is protected. So you can see that all countries are in the region of the repressed side. Actually, within the region, Uganda is a little bit higher, and this is not. This is first. This is not a reflection of the constitution, but actual protections for property rights. That's and the degree of our government gets involved in property rights. So you can see that most of the EAC countries are in the space of repressed. Tanzania, Kenya, between the three countries, Kenya is the lowest. For government integrity, and government integrity, as I had explained, and Jackie had explained, is now looking at corruption, the issue of corruption, the transparency in government policy making, the issue of those irregular bribes and payments, and also the general perception about corruption. So here, if you look at that, the EAC governments, the EAC three have been considered repressed since 2000 up to present, with only slight improvements as towards 2018 and 2020, 2020, but that performance from 2022, with the exception of Tanzania, Kenya and Uganda's performance dropped. dropped. And this is largely has something to do with the corruption and also the transparency in the policy making. Judicial effectiveness. Judicial effectiveness is in the index is a new phenomena. It's a new sub indicator that was added in 2016. And if you look at that, most of the EAC countries, Kenya's performance, most of it is still considered repressed, and Kenya's performance improved in 2023, while Uganda also Kenya's performance improved in 2024, while also Uganda improved in 2024, while Tanzania's judicial effectiveness is on three areas. As we've said, it's on the quality of judicial decisions. Number two, favoritism in obtaining, they're measuring whether there is favoritism in obtaining those judicial decisions. And the first one is on the question of judicial independence. The reason why Kenya improved is largely on our side an explanation of the implementation of the judiciary fund. That judicial independence in broadly on two areas: the operational independence, but a financial autonomy. So once that financial autonomy has been provided, so if you're able, for example, to manage judiciary fund, that the way judiciary it does now, that improves that aspect of independence. But there are other questions on the operational side. But the biggest challenge is on, especially for the case of Kenya, is on case backlogs. The other parts in Uganda, the operational independence of judiciary is something that they've not, that the judiciary has not been allowed to operate independently because some decisions, like the president writes to the court and the court rules in that direction. So those are some of the problems in Uganda, also compared to Tanzania. But in Kenya, the biggest factor that we think that improved this score in 2024 is the question of of that prioritization of the judiciary fund. But the other factors that still remain a significant problem. Trade freedoms. For trade, as Jackie had explained, it's now looking at the barriers. What is the average tariff? What is the average tariff? And also, what is, apart from the tariff, what is that? So what is the average tariff, and also the qualitative evaluation of non-trade barriers? Because non-tariff barriers, are not. So, for example, if quotas, so deciding that you can, for cereals, you can only bring in through quotas. So in this region, the trade freedom is where EAC, the general EAC, has a better performance in comparative terms to all other sub-indicators. And probably this can be informed by the way that the countries try from time to time to reduce those non-tariff barriers. But on the other side, the Uganda has a bigger average trade weighted tariff than Kenya and Tanzania. Tanzania has a lower, if I can confirm that number, has a lower rate, which is 9.7% of the trade average weighted tariff. But generally, you can easily see that this is one area where EAC has made, countries has made a significant reform. The investment freedom side, investment, in terms of investment, in Uganda, even though that the investment regime in Uganda is complex, and also additionally, that apart from it being complex, the level of bureaucracy, uh, they they allow investment in more areas. However, in Kenya, we have a more competitive uh, investment regime, but there is also a bigger share of SOEs, state-owned enterprises that undermine that private sector development, that undermine that private sector development. However, we also our constitution constrict land ownership, foreign land ownership, but in other countries that land ownership is allowed. Uh, in Uganda, in Tanzania, the biggest problem is now the question about uh, that even though the risk of expropriation is very high, of proper of investments is very high, but also uh, for them they allow investment in more areas in comparative terms, in comparison between Kenya and Uganda. However, investment freedom is largely a factor of macro environment. Kenya's macro environment, as you can see, that's why it has stayed stable. The towards from 2020, you can see that the line flattened for both Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Kenya has a bigger economy. However, the macroeconomic environment is not stable because of first, for example, on the issue of taxation, the taxation system is becoming more capricious on because now the state is trying to run faster to be able to get more revenues to repay debt, and that debt distress is a problem that is now getting into the investment side. However, if you look at the general if you look at the that general investment, this is one area where countries take a lot of time before they provide those necessary reforms and to implement them in a way that allows for more investment. And also, the investment freedom is a factor that is also affected by uh, the rules, how those domestic rules allow it brings the efficiency in attracting with the view of attracting in foreign investment. Then business freedom. This is on, as we had explained, different sub factors, but mostly it can be summarized in form of time and cost, share of income per capita, and procedures of opening business. So in the entire score for EAC, Kenya being better in the region, almost considered in the region of moderately free. Uh, uh, but the rest, and this business freedom is always a factor. Is always a factor of the size of the economy and the way governments optimize rules with the view of improving it, with the view of allowing that those freedoms. Government spending, all these countries are in the model. Kenya being a third are in the moderately free and free region. The size of government spending for is considered, which is that government spending is considered sometimes that expenditure allows governments to attain uh, specific goals, development goals, and that government spending now it's a expenditures as a share of total government spending of all levels as a percentage of GDP for the recent 3 years. So invest in terms of expenditure levels, they have all remained they all remain comparatively. They either going up or within that region. So this you all understand why that score would be high, because rarely do governments, EAC governments, for example, implement austerity measures on the, or that kind of a thing. Labor freedom, as we had explained, labor freedom is on in terms of the minimum wage as a ratio of value add per worker, rigidities in hiring, rigidities in also severance, the severance pay, and all those factors. This is a recent, it's also one of those indicators that was introduced after the index had already been prepared in 2005. And you can see that Kenya's performance in this has remained in the was first in the moderately free region, and then it went back now to mostly and free, and that applies for the same for the sharp fall in Uganda. And so much of, if you consider economic data, much of these of the of the those reductions are account for the COVID measures, because it changed structurally the labor markets in a way that they have not recovered up to today. So if you look at for example, for Kenya, to give a case of Kenya, in the 2023, looking at the latest available data on the unemployment numbers, uh, unemployment uh, 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 unemployment grew by as much as 1.5 million people because of the the total unemployment now here accounting uh, for in the total for both formal and informal, by, unemployment grew by something like 1.5 million on the account of COVID, and those numbers, they've never recovered, and that numbers again is reported on the poverty side. If you look at the Kenyan economic update that was published by World Bank last December 2023, it shows that poverty gap between urban and rural areas reduced. And then secondly, on the other side, you also see that urban poverty doubled. And those mostly due to, again, to type of the economic decisions, but also on the other side, a question of the effects of COVID. Then monetary freedom, as I'd explained, monetary freedom now is a measure that, and Jackie had explained, monetary freedom is a measure that the average inflation rate for the most recent years, 3 recent years, and also qualitative judgment and extent of government manipulation of prices through price controls and subsidies. Yeah. So in the EAC region, generally, you would see that for especially food and energy markets, that government control in food and energy markets is substantial, and that in itself, some of those market outcomes do not reflect real uh, re, uh, real are not a reflections of real market mechanisms, and rather than artificial outcomes uh, uh, by government. And secondly, if you look at inflation, Kenya has had the highest high inflation in the EAC region. Uh, Looking at, we took, for example, if we took the data from 2005 to 2024, projection of projected headline inflation for 2024, you look at Kenya has always been in the between 2.5 to 7.5%. Kenya is always in the on the upper bound, and two things explain inflation in Kenya, with with the exception of few years, especially the COVID years. Two things. Mostly, it's always food and fuel, and those both food and fuel are largely controlled through government mechanisms. And those government mechanisms there are studies that show, for example, that if you if you put price controls on fuel, you cause supply shortages. And or secondly, if you put price controls on fuels, that market mechanism, that efficiency that market players could bring into the sector will not be rarely achieved. And that's why we are always in high, especially when fuel prices are high, you see those high prices. And then now this is a reflection of the same. So inflation and the extent of government manipulation of prices through the others is a prominent feature. There are people who say that at for the stage of development, we expect that to see that, but rarely you don't see it, it's not something you agree with. Now, in terms of the EAC 3, Tanzania has a bigger score than us, than Kenya, and also than Uganda. Both Uganda's score has been falling in the last 3 years, and in comparative terms, Kenya's score, if you take a linear trend of the index of economic freedom, Kenya's score has been going down, and it's on many factors. But other factors are economical. Uh, the other factors like on judicial effectiveness, and so I just so that I mentioned in the conclusion. Let me conclude with what are priority areas, policy reform areas. So there are four areas that still pose a bigger challenge. So property rights, in terms of property rights, now protection of physical property, protection from uh, of intellectual property, uh, and then that problem of property rights is tied again to effectiveness or judicial effectiveness. Because judicial effectiveness would be able to resolve and bring those protections. And our main issues include case backlogs, and then the problem of corruption in that sector. Fiscal health, unless Kenya resolves, bring is able to bring public finances to sustainable path. Sustainable path is, uh, for example, fiscal deficits of less than 3%, which now reduces that primary balance, and then bring that public debt to to sustainable levels. Uh, and then you all know that between fiscal health, the deficits, debt is a result of deficits. It's an accumulation of deficit, and that's why you see that these areas. So the question of judicial effectiveness, it's be able to deal with case backlogs. And secondly, apart from reducing those case backlogs, to be able to bring efficiency in resolving those cases resolving cases. And then government integrity is the problem of more transparency on the policy side, uh, and especially in Kenya, transparency is starting to pick up on the lawmaking part, but on the other subsidiary through subsidiary legislation, so the subsidiary policy the subsidiary aspect of now lawmaking, that's where the bigger problem is. That transparency still, and then those other forms of, so this government policy that is made on an administrative basis, and then and also dealing with the problem of corruption. Then there is a bigger issue that is becoming more and more clear, that state-owned enterprises and is undermining private sector development, and that now the entire size of government is the entire size of government, 30% of GDP for the level of income that Kenya is at now is not something that is sustainable. This debt crisis is one factor that shows that that sustainability of the same. Yeah. Then what are the low hanging fruits? That moderate performance in trade, labor, investment, financial and business freedoms is something that could be expanded. More reforms are needed. So, for example, like for the labor freedom, one of the biggest issues that that you encounter is that one of the so, for example, like the State Department of Labor uh, has always been asking for resources, for more resources to be able to employ labor inspectors and deploy them so that people do not get up, beaten up in factories. Those labor inspectors are able to go through and confirm safety, the OSHA principles, the occupational safety and health hazards principles, looking at all those things and be able to deal with them and be able to bring enforcement on this side is something that is required. But now you realize that that is something that so those are reform areas. So a budget provision of something like 5 billion, for example, would be able to go in the next 5 or 7 years. Would be able to improve outcomes, and then generally better performance in the economy. That's the most important thing. So thank you. Back to you, Jackie.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Leo, for those useful insights. I think we've tried to demonstrate the best we can the findings from the most recent issue of the IEF and what those results mean for Kenya and for the broader EAC region. So without trying to go back to restate what we've already covered, I think we'll just go to plenary now because I see a number of questions on the chat box and see some questions from Kisimbi Thomas. So he starts with curious. He says, curious, the correlation between economic freedom and growth has been criticized by many studies. You seem to be stating it as correlated and even causal. So how do you respond to this? Also, he goes ahead to add that the Heritage Foundation is a conservative think tank, not a foundation as earlier stated, with a very strong free market ideology. Critics argue that the index is heavily influenced by this ideological perspective, favoring policies and practices aligned with the free market capitalism and limited government intervention, and has contributed to the current neoliberal order that brought about inequality within and amongst nations. So how useful is this for our understanding of where Kenya needs to go for equitable growth and opportunity for all? And then the third part is that the index defines economic freedom primarily in terms of private property rights, limited government intervention, and other free market principles. However, he says that this definition is contested, as some argue that economic freedom should also consider factors such as access to education, healthcare, and social safety nets. So the first three parts, I think maybe I should just continue. So he says that he sees the value, for example, the index offers to help stimulate discussions and debates around economic policies, property rights, and the role of government, provides a framework for comparing and evaluating different economic approaches. Then I wonder whether we view this as a tool for discussion rather than declarative statements about how these factors make growth happen. Then going to slide 10 to 13, he says it seems incongruent to confounding situations in China, relatively low economic freedom, and many Scandinavian countries. There can also, in terms of the taxation, there can also be many lacking variables, like how, for example, the richer countries become rich in the first place, and that many of them also grew rich in previous era, where they would score low on the index. Interesting. And then I think lastly, he says, I wonder when you look at sub-factors like property rights, given that these tend to be systemic, and that within a 5 to 10-year period, given that much of this might be a reflection of a government in power and or its interactions with the judiciary, how do we explain such variability in the index score? Understanding that it doesn't reflect the constitution, but actual actions of governments and the judiciary, but still these are systems in essence. And then there's now a subsequent, so we have a list of, so he has a very long question that we can break into bits. And then secondly, I see a question by Esther, who says, where is resource mobilization and revenue enhancement in achievement of economic freedom? So to begin to try and respond, or my response to Thomas before I invite Leo, I think the first part regarding questioning, where you're basically questioning or talking about the correlation between economic freedom and growth, and also that the criticism, the fact that this is done by the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative institution. I guess my response here would be that for us, what is important is that the concept of economic freedom is basically grounded in economic theory and logic. If we can satisfy ourselves the extent to which this is useful, then we can rely on, we find that we can rely on this tool. So it is clear, regardless of the heritage's inclination, ideological inclination, it is clear that when individuals, businesses, firms, as we've illustrated and as the results have shown, have the freedom to make economic decisions without excessive government intervention, then they are more likely to engage in productive activities that contribute to economic growth. So I don't think we can argue that, for instance, where we have lower regulatory burdens and barriers to entry into business and entrepreneurship, for instance, that this would accelerate innovation, which of course are drivers of economic expansion. So we might debate, or Leo might be better placed to debate with you on the correlation, but evidence has shown, and what is important for us is that evidence has shown that countries with greater economic freedom tend to experience higher levels of economic growth over time. And I think we've also illustrated that with what the data is showing us in terms of the standard of living, economic freedoms and the relations with the standard of living, and incomes, that incomes correlate very strongly with economic freedom. So that causality thing it may be challenging to attribute 100%, given a few exceptions here and there. For instance, the case of China, the few countries that you've referred to. But I think, in my view, there's more than one thing that is ranked. So while it may be difficult to establish a direct causal link, the weight of evidence that we have here suggests to us that the greater the economic freedom, then the higher the likelihood for greater economic prosperity, and that we cannot argue with. Then the second aspect is, and this is still related to what the heritage, the fact that this is done by the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank. True, but that has not, for us, I know critics have argued that, but that has not been a major concern for us as a program when looking at this tool, specifically because we have satisfied ourselves that the methodology that is used to develop this index is sound. So if we could question any part of that methodology, then we would also question the reliability of the results that they have arrived at. So because they have a very transparent methodology, which we have ascertained to be sound, we feel that and we also see that the results are consistent with our contextual circumstances. So again, the reason that we use this is because the methodology is sound and the results obviously are in line with the realities here on the ground, not only in Kenya, but also in the EAC region. That's why we always try to make a comparative assessment of beyond Kenya, what are the findings telling us, and are those findings consistent? So regardless of whether or not we agree with the ideological inclinations of the heritage, the fact that we can get some useful policy insights that we can suggest or that can be discussed with policymakers, given the areas that we have identified from that index, or the areas that the index has pointed out as being weaknesses, then I think for us that is primarily our objective. So then I think the other thing that you asked, the other thing that I could attempt to respond to is regarding that definition. So you say that the definition of the index mostly focuses on, he says the definition, the index defines economic freedom primarily in terms of private property rights, limited government intervention, and so on, and add that other factors should be considered, mostly related to social services, that's education, healthcare, and so on, and the safety nets and social safety nets. And basically, here, what I'd say is true. Again, you make a valid claim. And while it is true that that definition could be expanded or made broader to include other factors, the only thing here I feel is that even if we expanded it, it would not necessarily, even if we expanded that definition to include the factors that you suggest, it does not negate it does not necessarily negate the economic freedoms as we see them defined here. So even if we expanded the definition as it is, it does not necessarily imply that it would be a rejection of free market principles. It would only be useful to expanding it. Whether or not we add this, basically what I'm trying to say is whether or not we would expand the definition, we have ascertained that the free market principles by themselves still would not be negated by any addition. And in terms of, I see the interconnectedness between social factors, the things that you mention here. So I see how they can influence the free market principles. So for instance, when you talk about investments in education and healthcare, I see how that would improve human capital, which then eventually would promote economic productivity and growth. So they are interconnected, but then expanding it would not mean rejecting the free market principles. So I think that's the only way in which the critics to this fail to recognize that. So the same way social programs, for instance, or those social safety nets can provide a cushion against economic shocks, improving like the economy's resilience and stability, is the same with these other factors we've seen operate to expand economic growth. So it doesn't, in short, it would not negate the results we have today. So far, that would be my 2 cents. I think I can add Leo to add or respond to the other issues, or to add to what I've said, if he agrees.
Yeah. So again, if you look at the index, you realize that the fact that there are very few elements of uh, of 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 qualitative. What is qualitative? But mostly it's economic data. So if you are doing labor freedom and you're asking what is the mandatory severance rate pay, or what is the ratio of minimum wage to the value add per worker, that is something you can demonstrate through numbers, through data. So for us, question of economic data. It's not a question of so for example that person A or body A is a Marxist, or body B is so we evaluate merits of ideas, and I think that is one of the functions of think tanks. We evaluate merits of ideas. So for example, people say there's a question by Kisimbi to say that that so that the definition contested. Some argue that economic freedom should also consider factors of access to education, healthcare, and social safety nets. If you realize the indicator on government spending, actually, if you have higher expenditure as a share of GDP, the average for the last 3 years, they give you an higher score. And that's why you see for all EAC countries, we're in the region of relatively free and mostly free and relatively. So people say, people take idea. What is that indicator favors larger expenditures. That's why Nordic countries are ranked high on this on this, because if you have a bigger share of expenditure, you're able to respond to many other fiscal policy imperatives as a share of GDP. So people say conservative, and then they don't look at what the index measures, and then actually think about something else, because that is not true. But again, because we have to evaluate these ideas on merit, not on the other. So so this is a measure. So there's a definition of economic freedom. Economic freedom is this: it allows liberties, uh, your own individual liberty, to make a decision on what should be produced, on what area of economy you can go to, on what or it's liberty. Liberty is that ability to be able to participate in the market, to participate in any part of the market without coercion, without all these other things. So, and that's a main thing. It's not economic freedom is not, for example, it's not similar to Human Development Index, the HDI. It's not the same. It's not. Here we are measuring. You're measuring that. What is the extent of government involvement in the economy? But again, uh, I agree with you, Kisimbi, on a question of I see the value of stimulating discussions and debates around economic policy, property rights, and role of government in the economy. It's a framework for comparison. But I want to, on slide 10, 11, 12, and 13, to it seems incongruent to confounding situations in China, relatively low economic freedom, and many Scandinavian countries, high taxation regimes. They could be lacking variables on how the rich countries became rich in the first place, and then the other can how rich other countries, and many of them grew rich in previous era when they will score low on the index. Again, if you look at the top of the index, it's not your usual it's not your usual countries that you'd expect, like the United States. It's not most of the advanced economies. The top of the index is Switzerland, Taiwan, those smaller countries, Ireland. So if you start to look at those properly and examine, so it's for me, economic freedoms play a bigger role. And what people most so first to say, China's pace now, China's income is almost at the low at the income per capita is at the world's average, around $14,000. The others, like Singapore, $72,000. So if United States, so Taiwan and the others are way above that. But mostly, what people explain as the responsible for Chinese economic miracle, for example, that raised 200 million out of poverty, is the free market, opening up China that the then China leader of the then leader of China did after the Mao era is what is, and those are studies that show the same. So I don't necessarily see that comparison. It's not. This is not an historical debate, this is not an historical debate. But what I wanted to say is there's very high correlation now on that innovation. So, for example, like for countries like Taiwan and the rest, that explains that explains that explains that economic freedoms and that innovation go hand in hand, and economic freedom and that standard of living goes hand in hand, goes hand in hand. So for me, that's of the story confounding in China. China's income per capita is at the average, the world average, while what we'll call advanced economies, leaders of advanced economies, are in above the above 40,000 range on an annual basis. So we can't. That is not something we can compare. I wonder. So on the comment that from Kisimbi again to say, I wonder if you look at sub factors like property rights, given that tend to be systemic, and within a 5-year, 10-year period, given that much might be a reflection in government in power or its interactions with judiciary, how do you explain variability in that, understanding that it does not reflect the constitution, but actual actions of government and judiciary. So I agree. I agree on that question. That is something that we could provide from. You could test the data further to explain more and more about the same. Yeah. So back to you, Jackie. Thank you.
Okay, yes. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Leo. I see his continued thanks, Kisimbi, for your additions, and thank you again for this very engaging discussion. I also see my colleague Emmanuel has tried to help us respond to some of the questions that are in the chat box. So thanks, Emmanuel. I'd like to start with this. So Kisimbi says, on aggregate, I value freedom over repression for sure, just to be clear. I think that clarification is very good. Good to know. But I mean, if we go back to the additional questions, I think furthering the discussion on China and the methodology used, questions around it. He says, for example, do you value growth over inequality? So he says, let me just start by, yeah, so the methodology has a number of academic articles and so on. I think a good discussion is to be had about the country we want. For example, do we value growth over inequality, especially if addressing inequality means a heavier government hand? I think, okay, make a fair point on the interconnectedness. Then apart from a challenge to the framing of the index, I think there are some interesting discussion points we can have. Some of the contextual discussions about Kenya, if we value capital over labor, for example, how does that how does that make us as a nation? Then Emmanuel states, responds to, I think, some of the previous assertions, that I think we make the mistake of stating outrightly that nations like China got wealthy without becoming free, without examining exactly what we mean. That is, that market equilibriums can be satisfied while the state continues to bloat, and we discount opportunity costs of the very pursuit of statism. The opportunity cost here being debt and hemorrhaging of national treasury through leakage. Then Kisimbi says, this, okay. This would be a historic look of how we know many of them grew rich, which also includes what we know as factual about how free labor and expropriation of goods and services from their colonies contributed to their wealth. Agreed liberalization of certain aspects of its economy, but not all, yes. Isn't there a reason, for example, isn't there a reason, for example, why a billionaire in the US wouldn't have the same freedoms as a billionaire in China? Then Dominic says it's called rent-seeking behavior, corporatism. Okay, so I see a full-on conversation happening in the chat box, which is what we encourage and are very grateful for. As I stated when we were beginning this discussion, the reason why we hold such webinars is to encourage this type of conversations, to have informed dialogue, so that even as we contribute to policy formulation from whatever corners we are in, it's informed by evidence and thought through and debated, criticized, and so on. That's the only way you arrive at coherent, concrete perspectives. So I mean, I don't know that there's maybe there's anything further to respond to. We can have a further discussion, but the only thing that I would say is when that, regarding the question that you've asked about what do we value? Do we value growth over inequality, especially if addressing inequality means a heavier government hand? If I understood your question, I mean, from my perspective, I don't think economic growth and economic freedoms must be viewed as being mutually exclusive. So those two things are actually supposed to coexist. I mean, there are trade-offs that can be made in some instances, but I think the biggest challenge for our policy proposals and for our policymakers is thinking about balancing priorities. So, for instance, the index, this IEF, basically emphasizes policies that promote economic efficiency and competitiveness, which are typically associated with higher levels of growth. But when we think about addressing inequality, it's also essential for promoting long-term growth and long-term cohesion. So balancing these priorities is what we need to think about, the nuanced approach to it. I don't think that viewing them as, I think that viewing these two things as being mutually exclusive might be oversimplifying. This is my opinion, might be oversimplifying the dynamics of development. But I think my main thing is just thinking about balancing this and seeing how actually economic freedoms and advocating for enhanced or increased economic freedoms can be seen as a pathway to also enhancing inclusion, to also enhancing inclusive growth. So Leo, you can add to this. I see it's already 12:40, so we should start concluding. I don't know if there's somebody. There was a question, I think, that had been asked previously by Esther, something about where is resource mobilization and revenue enhancement in achievement of economic freedom. I don't know if you want to attempt to answer that, and also attempt to answer everything else that's might still be pending from Kisimbi, and then make your closing remarks because it's now almost a quarter to one.
Yeah. So Um, just to expound further, you see, dealing mostly uh, uh, having an heavier government hand, like the way Kisimbi has characterized, is is not does not have anything to do. It has everything to do with economic freedom, because you see, in Kenya, the biggest problem now, like for example, when the previous administrations, and actually every political party campaigns in Kenya, they say we are going to have these priorities, but what they don't explain is that those priorities have a tax implication, and that tax implication again affects your economic freedoms directly. So you run the taxes we are complaining about today, that is affecting our economic, the tax burden that is affecting our economic freedom today, is the 11, 12% fiscal deficits that the Jubilee administration ran. So we need to have that interconnectedness. You see, like we have to have clarity that, and even on another thing, just to add, as economists, and this is because this is the Institute of Economic Affairs, economics provide places where government can intervene. And actually, there are reasons, for example, where there are market failures, government is allowed to intervene. But not that what people say is that government is buys everything. Then we end up with a bigger tax burden in the future. And then now we start to say that that one addresses equality. That one we are not addressing inequality. The best way to address inequality is through the market outcomes. Everybody has to go into most people have to go into the labor market. How do you run an economy at full employment? That is something that is already provided in economics. So I want to push back against this idea that there is something that economic progress can only happen if there is a stronger government hand. No, it cannot. The stronger the arm of the arm government government should only intervene in areas where and specifically where there is market failure, uh, uh, during a recession, during a recession, and in those very limited circumstances, providing for indigents and providing for now meeting all constitutional obligations, like for the case of Kenya, where we already have there's already a commitment on how fiscal policy should be done, like the social and economic Article 43 rights. But to say that an heavier government, and for example, that corrals people to uh, that we should have a protected steel industry, and then Kenyans pay the most expensive steel or cement, some of the most expensive cement in Africa. We don't, that, those ones are things that directly affect economic freedoms. We have the markets provide important outcomes. And this is something, for example, that I want to give an example, a nuance, a policy nuance. President Kibaki showed us. People nowadays in Nairobi, club say that Nairobi has a very strong e-commerce, a strong e-commerce, in strong e-commerce, and that strong e-commerce is propelled by these motorcycles or bikes, for example, for that case. People forget that before President Kibaki came in, you could only get those bikes from 3 franchises. However, President Kibaki liberalized that market, allowing people to bring these what we call now Chinese and Indian motorbike into and those ones now, when the e-commerce the e-commerce took over, when the now the e-commerce came about, so that ability, that lack of involvement that government had, that those rules that government that government had removed in 2003 was able to provide that faster growth of this sector. So we have to think. We have to think. What is government by? What is that? What government is by? What is government by? And secondly, what is government's role? And mostly for the case for the EAC, and because we have the data and we can comment authoritatively, we know that uh, mostly government, those rents are extracted. Government wants to intervene in the economy, but those rents are extracted by fewer people who are closer to political power. So we want market mechanism that is able to distribute that producer surplus and consumer surplus, reducing that debt weight loss that the society reducing that debt weight loss, because that debt weight loss is market and outcomes to share. So, and that's why we want full employment. We want the economy at full employment. We want uh, uh, a tax burden that can be borne by farms and households, but not overstretched. Not that has been overstretched. Then we have to provide those economic. So liberty is an important factor. Liberty is an important factor. That's why we need to emphasize that as the Institute of Economic Affairs, markets distributes mechanisms. So, for example, there's another study, poverty study done in collaboration between Kenyan universities, the World Bank, and the government of Kenya, that shows that poverty response of economic growth to poverty has been reducing from 2005. That is an important factor. Markets are not redistributing that. So, and people saying government intervention, we saying let Kenyans have something that they can actually pay for. But in essence, what we see. So in my concluding remarks, I just want to emphasize this. Uh, uh, so just to answer one question that I'm seeing, that one part of the conversation that I'm seeing in the chat, you know, economists develop what you call complexity, and you develop complexity because you are able to structurally transform. You're able to gain those skills to develop that human capital. Markets are the ones that allocate capital, and once markets are allocate capital and all these other things, you develop that complexity. That complexity is something. So, for example, now it's now almost 60 years later, but Joakali is still a major feature of our economy, while other countries that Kenya was at the same level of development with, have developed a very stronger, have developed very economic complexities to be able to produce some of those complex goods that require more technology. So, and that can only happen if we allow markets to allocate those things. So, for example, whether should a farmer grow coffee is a decision. So, like in the case of Kenya, central Kenya, should a farmer grow coffee is a decision that was made when coffee prices crashed, and others opted to, for example, whether to put it in real estate, or others went to other different crops like tea or the others. But if it was up to government bureaucrats to decide where those resources go to, it's something that uh, uh, it's something that would have never happened. Uh, so thank you. In my concluding remarks, me based on data, based on different studies, based on data, based on different studies, we we value economic liberty, and that those liberties to enter into markets, to for those individual decisions to be able to do anything in the economy should not be affected by whether, for example, whether it's government policy. It should not be that. So we should be able to see a advanced rule of law. We want to see a government size that Kenyans can bear. We also want to see efficient regulatory bodies, which means that government has to get out of the economy and only deal with the regulation role and market openness. Market openness. There should be markets, whether it's trade, whether it's investment, whether it's financial, and the others. So that's our own. That's my own. That's the conclusion, and that's what we are looking for. We want people to make those decisions themselves, not what government can, not what government can provide. We can't continue. We have to. We that that in itself is something that we have to emphasize. That we have to emphasize. I thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Leo. Thank you to everyone who has stayed with us for the duration of this meeting. We appreciate the very meaningful engagement that we've had on this discussion. I think it has only served to help us enrich the conversation. And so, of course, we argue, as I mentioned, and as Leo has also mentioned in his conclusion, is that for us, we value and we argue that the extent of economic freedom is linked very strongly to prosperity, to economy's resilience, and I mean, so basically, the quality, we cannot overemphasize the usefulness or the link between the quality of our state institutions and the capacity of that nation to develop. So thank you all for being here. We will share this presentation. I see a number of you have also shared other articles on the platform, which can enrich this discussion and expand our perspectives. I think we will all, if you would like to refer to any of the ones that have been shared on the chat box, please do so. Then the IEA is a membership institution, so we accept individual members, corporate members, even student. We even have a category for student memberships. So if you're interested in being a member and participating more actively on this, as well as whatever other benefits our members receive, please feel free to sign up. You can get in touch with our communications team or go to our website and look for the membership tab and then follow the instructions, and we will be able to assist you. Then we normally, as I mentioned, as we began, we normally have such discussions and similar discussions regularly. Tomorrow, another program will be hosting discussion. I think tomorrow is World Consumer Day, so our Economic Regulation and Competition Policy Program will be hosting a webinar. So for those of you who might be interested to join that discussion, please also do so. And yeah, we are always glad to have you. So other than that, we thank you again on behalf of the IEA. We thank you. The presentation and this discussion will be available on YouTube. And we look forward to further engagements in future. So have a good afternoon, everyone. And thanks. And thanks again, Leo, for the presentation.